One of the most infamous examples of a production company that showed a lot of promise but would eventually crash and burn is Carolco Pictures. What's interesting is that they made a number of notable box office hits and had major stars under contract to them, but that was not enough to keep them afloat. Carolco was founded in 1976 by Mario Kassar and Andrew Vajna, who aimed to finance films, often partnering with foreign producers and distributors, with them typically pre-selling the international rights. They started out chipping in funds for primarily action films. Carolco's first production was the Canadian film The Silent Partner, which was well received by critics and performed well at the box office. Another Canadian film they produced was the horror picture The Changeling. Both of these movies were made to take advantage of a tax incentive program in Canada at the time and led to Carolco backing more films in the Great White North. However, the movie that would really put them on the map is First Blood. An adaptation of David Morrell's novel had been in the works for a while, first at Columbia and then at Warner Brothers, but struggled to get off the ground. Kassar and Vajna saw potential in the material, bought the rights from WB, and then signed Sylvester Stallone to star, with Stallone also contributing to the script. When the movie was released, it was a big success. Seeing potential in a franchise about Rambo, Carolco immediately got to work on a sequel, even bringing on board James Cameron to help write it. Rambo First Blood Part 2 was also successful, although it took the series in a different direction, with its emphasis on over-the-top action. However, that action spectacle would be something Carolco would attempt to implement on many of their event films, and what most people associate with the name. First Blood Part 2 was also notable for being the first what would be a long distribution partnership with TriStar Pictures. Carolco produced Alan Parker's Angel Heart, although ran into issues with the MPAA, who wanted to give it an X rating, and Parker was forced to cut a few seconds to get it down to an R. While the movie was well received, it disappointed at the box office. They also produced Walter Hill's western Extreme Prejudice, which was similarly well liked by critics, but did not attract much attention theatrically. Carolco tried to get into animation when they produced Pound Puppies and The Legend of Big Paw. Despite Hanna-Barbera having recently made a Pound Puppies television series, they had no involvement with this movie, which was produced quickly and cheaply. TriStar did not give it much of a release though, and it pulled in low grosses. With these disappointments, Carolco was really banking on Rambo 3 to help them out. The film went through a number of script drafts before the cameras finally rolled, with Stallone receiving a reported paycheck of about $16 million. While Rambo 3 did respectable numbers, they were substantially less than what Part 2 earned and were considered a bit of a disappointment. Carolco knew they needed a lot more than just Rambo movies to survive and did make a number of investments to try and help their stock price. They formed a stake in the home video distribution company International Video Entertainment, with their films being released on video through them. Carolco's international division also helped with distribution on a number of films, including the John Carpenter movies Prince of Darkness and They Live. Back to their in-house productions, Carolco saw potential in the action comedy Red Heat starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, but it only did moderate business. Some of the other non-Rambo productions at the tail end of the 80s did not fare particularly well. These included the prison film Lock-Up with Sylvester Stallone, Walt Hill's crime film Johnny Handsome with Mickey Rourke, and the thriller Music Box starring Jessica Lange. Despite these setbacks, directors did like working with Carolco, as they tend to give them a decent amount of creative control. As Carolco continued to try to reach the big leagues, one person who disagreed with this was actually Andrew Vajna, as he felt Mario Kassar and President Peter Hoffman were expanding the company too quickly. He eventually sold his Carolco shares to Kassar and created a new company named Synergy Pictures, signing a deal with Disney. One of the biggest projects that Carolco would produce was the science fiction action movie Total Recall. The film was originally developed at the Laurentis Entertainment Group, with David Cronenberg at one point set to direct. After they filed for bankruptcy, Arnold Schwarzenegger convinced Carolco to buy the rights. After doing so, Paul Verhoeven was hired to direct on Schwarzenegger's suggestion, and when the movie was released in the summer of 1990, it became a big hit. The rest of the year was not able to match the highs of Total Recall, though. Mountains of the Moon, a drama about British explorers in Africa, was a flop, while the Vietnam War film Air America, starring Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr., and the thriller Narrow Margin with Gene Hackman were also disappointments. Even the horror movie Jacob's Ladder, despite being well received and later developing a cult following, was not a hit on original release. That year, Carolco decided to partner with New Line Cinema on some of their lower budget films, an adventure they named Seven Arts. Most of the films, including the Exorcist spoof Repossessed and the crime movie King of New York, did not get much of a release, although the drama Rambling Rose was well received, winning the Independent Spirit Award for Best Feature and earning Oscar nominations for Laura Dern and Diane Ladd. A film Carolco, along with Schwarzenegger and James Cameron, was very keen on making was a sequel to The Terminator. The first movie was produced by Hemdale Films, which held onto the rights to make a sequel. Eventually, Carolco was able to buy the sequel rights from Hemdale, and Cameron got right to work making the movie. With the film utilizing state-of-the-art computer-generated effects, the budget soared, and when the movie was released, it was a humongous hit, becoming the highest-grossing film of 1991. You would think Carolco would be on top of the world thanks to Terminator 2, and yet they lost over $265 million that year. What happened? Well, in addition to some of the flops I mentioned earlier, the company had gained a reputation for spending a lot of money. Mario Kassar had ambitions of creating a stable of directors and actors, which led him to court big names. Not only Stallone and Schwarzenegger, but Rennie Harlin and Oliver Stone too. He would give them the biggest salaries at that point, which annoyed the other studios who then had to pay more to compete. Kassar also spent lavishly on personal gifts. If Schwarzenegger wanted a private jet, he would get a private jet. He also became known for expensive yacht parties at the Cannes Film Festival. All this, in addition to the underperformers, ate into the potential profits from the hits. Carolco gets some additional financing from other investors, including the Japanese electronics company Pioneer and the French media company Canal+. But of course, that also meant having to pay them back. Nonetheless, Carolco tried to stay afloat as best as they could. Also released in 1991, and a film Carolco saw potential in, was a biopic of The Doors. They brought in Oliver Stone to direct, although the finished film got mixed reviews and the surviving members of the band did not think highly of it. The movie was also a box office disappointment. Carolco did have a major success with Paul Verhoeven's erotic thriller Basic Instinct. While there was some controversy due to the sexual content, that probably helped the film's box office and made it one of the most talked about movies of 1992. Carolco also had hopes the action movie Universal Soldier could turn the tide for them, although it proved to be a much bigger success overseas than in North America. Another film they had high hopes for was Richard Attenborough's Chaplin, his biopic of Charlie Chaplin, starring Robert Downey Jr. While Downey would receive an Oscar nomination for his performance, the critics gave it mixed reviews and it flopped. With that piling losses, Carolco had to make some decisions in order to stay afloat. One of them involved selling the television rights to that film library to Spelling Entertainment, with those rights now being owned by Paramount. Carolco was initially set to produce Robert Redford's A River Runs Through It, but they dropped the film with Columbia Pictures eventually releasing it. Carolco's debts would also have an effect on the production of Cliffhanger, that only released in 1993. The film went wildly over budget, with Carolco struggling to pay the crew. TriStar would then be brought in to provide half the film's budget and received a generous percentage of the gross. Cliffhanger was very successful, but because of the financing arrangement, most of the money went to TriStar, other profits to additional investors, and almost nothing to Carolco. The final production released by TriStar was the western comedy Wagons East. That film ran into its own difficulties when John Candy died near the end of production, and the filmmakers had to come up with ways to complete his planned scenes using other methods. When the movie was released, it was panned by critics and ignored by moviegoers. But again, despite these setbacks, Carolco still felt confident they could continue. One project they planned on making was a Spider-Man movie. They had acquired the film rights in the late 80s after the Cannon Group failed to produce a movie, and eventually brought on board James Cameron to write and direct. He turned in a treatment with plans to direct Spider-Man after True Lies. It was never made, partly because of Carolco's financial issues, and partly because of a complicated legal battle with MGM and Marvel over the rights. In 1993, when their TriStar partnership was nearing its end, Carolco signed a new distribution deal with MGM. They would continue that big spending with Roland Emmerich's science fiction adventure Stargate. Coming in at a $55 million budget, they made that film largely independently and then sold the rights to MGM. Stargate would become a hit, even launching a successful television franchise for MGM. To help raise some money for other productions, Carolco decided to sell Paul Verhoeven's Showgirls to the French investment company Chagrin, with MGM releasing the movie as part of their deal. Despite trying to use the film's NC-17 rating to garner publicity, the movie flopped at the box office, so Carolco probably would not have benefited from keeping the film. With money dwindling, Carolco decided to roll the dice on one last movie to try and possibly get them out of the red. The choice came down to two movies. One was an historical epic about the Crusades, set to be directed by Paul Verhoeven and starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. The other was a pirate movie titled Cutthroat Island, with Rennie Harlin directing and Michael Douglas and Gina Davis attached to the star. Despite the successes Verhoeven and Schwarzenegger previously contributed to Carolco, there were concerns about the proposed $100 million budget. Verhoeven refused to budge, so they ultimately went with Cutthroat Island, which had a planned budget of $60 million, although Carolco still hoped to possibly make Crusade afterwards. However, problems already began when Douglas dropped out, with Matthew Modine eventually being hired after several other actors turned down the role. Then the budget of the movie escalated during the production, adding to the pressure for the movie to succeed. However, a lot of people on set already had an inkling that this would likely be Carolco's last movie. Even before Cutthroat Island was released, they filed for bankruptcy, signaling its days were indeed numbered. When the movie hit screens, it was a massive flop, not even reaching the top 10 during its Christmas opening weekend, and theaters wasted no time removing it from their screens. As a result, Carolco's library went up for sale. 20th Century Fox attempted to buy the film rights, but were ultimately outbid by Canal+, who now handles the films through Studio Canal. Meanwhile, the sequel rights to Total Recall were bought by Dimension Films, but they never got around to making Total Recall 2. Dimension also got the Rambo sequel rights, although they eventually sold those to Millennium Films. After Synergy Pictures was shut down, Andrew Vashner decided to reteam with Mario Kassar and start a new company named C2 Pictures. And in an interesting twist, they ended up acquiring the sequel rights to Terminator and Basic Instinct, with them eventually producing Terminator 3 and Basic Instinct 2, as well as the Terminator television series, The Sarah Connor Chronicles. You would think this would be the end of Carolco Pictures, but in 2015, an independent film company named Bricktop Productions acquired the name in an attempt to revive Carolco and even brought in Mario Castor as the chief development executive and then chairman. However, this did not last very long, with Castor then leaving and the company changed its name to Recall Studios. So now Carolco Pictures really is done, although crazier things have happened in Hollywood and maybe we'll see the name again. In any case, it's hard to deny Castor and Vachner's excitement in making these audience spectacles, and they produced several worthwhile films, but it was a case where throwing a lot of money around brought extra problems to them that they ultimately had trouble digging out of. See you next time.